Aloha mai kako. I'm just gonna greet everyone, but knowing that it is just right now that it's popping on everyone's screen that we are going live here today with our continuation of honoring Prince Kūhiō Kalaniana'ole. Just give it a few seconds more. Yeah, my kaikeia. Okay, I see us now on Facebook, and we are live. Again, aloha mai kako, ina hoa maka maka. Ai mai kahi pai a kahi pai, mai keia kihi a me ke la kihi, a puni ka honua. Aloha mai kako. O ano ho'i o me hana o ka la hind, and I am joined today by my pakana, Hailama Farden. Of course, as we journey through the life of Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole for this month, as part of a year-long celebration of our ali'i and Oiwi leadership, brought to you by a group of organizations who we've termed the year-long celebrations Lei Ali'i. Yeah, and before we start, I want to just do a plug for the website. You can always look for more information about what is going on in or throughout this year on leiali'i.org. Yeah, but I want to bring on Hailama at this moment, and if you could share a pule with us.
Ai, aloha mai kako a pauloa, e pule kako. E ke li ka makola ni ki loa o ko ke au holokoa. E hoi mako maka pule e kolu o ke ia o ike a mako malalo ke ia apahana o leali'i. Ke kua o iei mako e pule nei a o ke honani aku nei a o a ke pule aku nei I ko mako aloha nui I ke ali'i o Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole. Ke ali'i maka ainana no hoi. Ke kua, nau noi ho mai ka ika mako papahana ke iela me Dr. Davianna McGregor o mako hoa. Ke kua e ho ike mai mako ka mako mau haawina mako e a oai ke iela no ka pono ka ke a oana I ke ia ho oilina ali'i o Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole pi'ikoi. No laila ke kua, mahalo nui ia oe. Love ia mako mau ke papahana, a pau ka mako papahana, hoi ia mako ka mako kule ana makainoa, o kau keiki hoi ia superstar. Amen. Mahalo mehana and mahalo again for helping us be the hostess with the mostest for this program. And sitting here as one of the organizations, Kamehameha Schools, the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, of course, CNHA, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. We have the King Kamehameha Day Celebration Commission and DHHL, of course, among other hui who have joined us in helping build this papahana. We're going to be looking at Leali this month. This is week 3, as I mentioned, my pule. And we are so delighted that Dr. Davianna McGregor has given some time for us to share with us the important foundations of the organization which I serve as president, the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, starting in that earlier time with the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua na Hawaii. We again hope to relaunch this program with the same hui of Ohana and maybe more in June for Kamehameha Pai'ea. And hopefully, if all works well, we will do the same for our beloved Princess Bernice Boy Bishop in December. And Leali'i, of course, embracing the lei of the legacy of our ali'i. And here we are, a lei together as a family. And mahalo again, mehana.
No, mahalo Hailama for always setting us on the right course with your pule. And I'd like to acknowledge our former guests here too, where everybody, if you want to hear what they had shared about Prince Kūhi'o, please go to leiali'i.org. But at this time, acknowledge Kumu Manu Boyd and his very Manu Boyd presentation, yeah. And if you don't know what I mean, go check it out on leiali'i.org. It's full of mele, full of insight, a few pictures, all brought to you by, in his living room. So mahalo nui manu. And then of course, Dr. Kalaniana'ole, mahalo nui for his PowerPoint. And one of the jewels that came out of that was that very precious recording of that mele that Kawena Pukui is chanting on there. That was one of my favorite moments on there. So just a little bit of leading up to today's presentation. And thank you again, Hailama, for introducing the topic. And I'd like to introduce the person now that we have joining us here today. And that is Dr. Davianna McGregor. Who, I've actually never had the privilege of taking her class up at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. By the time I got to Manoa, I had such a strict regimen on, what classes I could take to finish my degree that I wasn't able to. But nonetheless, everyone around me, and then because of that, myself has been influenced by the teachings of Dr. McGregor in the university context. But what she did was, which was so important, was shift the lives and the thought and the thinking of many young Hawaiians and non-Hawaiian allies, because she introduced them to Kaho'olawe. That very precious, it's more than a moku, right? It is a movement. It is an enduring inspiration for now generations of Native Hawaiians. And if not for Dr. McGregor's influence at that very pivotal time in many of our lives, going through the university system, many of us would not have even approached the subject of Kaho'olawe or placed our feet and our bodies and our sweat, and our tears on that mokupuni, to help it out. So but she's much more than that. Yeah, she has become a significant figure in that particular part of our lahui, and thus over the years, I'm thinking, and I'm sorry I didn't get this number accurate ahead of time, but you've probably been at the university for close to 30 years, possibly even more.
40 years.
40 years. See, I was gonna say that, but I thought for a second there, it's like telling a woman's age. Yeah, I better be very good about how many years I've said you've been there. Yeah, but close to 40 years, and just a great mama. I've had the privilege to watch Rosie, her daughter, grow up and become the amazing academic that she is at the university, no doubt to her makua. Yeah, both her makua who are there. And just your overall, again, Dr. McGregor, just from me, and I know for many of us in the Lahui, your constant presence in not only Kaho'olawe, but also ensuring that our history, in the context of our history, our political history, our social history, those that range from the Maka'ainana, to quote the title of her book that she has. If you don't have it, go get it. It must become part of your Native Hawaiian library. All the way until, all the way up the stratum of our societies with our ali'i, which is what she'll talk about today. So all that to say, mahalo nui, thank you. And thank you for your patience with us as we got this thing going. Aloha mai, Dr. McGregor.
Aloha, mahalo for that really beautiful introduction, and aloha, hailama, mahalo nui for the pule to open us up. I'm so glad you folks asked me to share about Prince Kūhi'o, especially as we're approaching his birthday, and we're also approaching the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act and Hawaiian Homelands Program, which he was instrumental and pivotal in establishing. So I wanted to start by sharing some slides and some background on the role that Prince Kūhi'o played in establishing the Hawaiian Homelands Program, but also more importantly in positioning Native Hawaiians to challenge the oligarchy that had taken over the Hawaiian government and the oligarchy that ruled Hawaii during the territorial period. And we often think that he only collaborated with them and allied with them within the Republican Party, but no, he actually challenged their rule when he saw that they were not supporting the best living conditions and advancing Native Hawaiians. So I wanted to share that, and I'll start sharing with my PowerPoint, if that's okay. And then I'll just share some and then stop and we can talk. I'll just go through the first part of it here. Okay, so the other, I want to introduce to you the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua o nā Hawaii, which translates into the Hawaiian Protective Association. And before Prince Kūhiō had established the Hawaiian Civic Clubs, he established the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua o nā Hawaii. And so I'm going to give you some background on that organization. But I wanted to acknowledge too that Prince Kūhiō was important in reestablishing the royal societies, which had been banned since annexation. So I guess since the overthrow and annexation, the royal societies had to go underground. And I'm going to just read from my notes here. So I'm going to just put that here. Oops. Oh, I'm not sure. I have to go looking in my notes. Can't see my notes. Okay. Well, the problem was that as I said, all of these societies had been disbanded under the period of the, oh here, now you can see it, under the period of, since the overthrow to annexation. So in 1865, King Kamehameha V had established the Royal Order of Kamehameha I to honor his grandfather. And the annexationists viewed the group as a threat, and the Royal Order went underground during the decade after the 1893 overthrow until 1903, when Prince Kuhio publicly reintroduced the Royal Order in a ceremony at the statue of Kamehameha I fronting Ali'iolani Hale. And then the other is the Ka'ahumanu Society, which was established by Princess Victoria Kamamalu in 1864 and named for Kamehameha's most politically influential wife. And here again, they had to go underground, but they were reorganized by Native Hawaiian women, daughters, and granddaughters of Hawaiian Ili'i in June 1905. Being inspired by the re-emergence of the Royal Order of Kamehameha. And then the Hale o Na'ali'i o Hawaii, which was preceded in the Kingdom era by the Hale Nawa Society, but it was formed in April 7, 1918, and since 1920 has been under the leadership of the Kauananakoa family, descendants of Prince David Kauananakoa and Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole. And then the Daughters and Sons of Hawaiian Warriors, Mama Kakawa, formed in 1913. The original organization was made up solely of women. When the Daughters of Hawaii Warriors decided to admit men, the women established an ancestral qualification for membership. So I just wanted to share those precedents to these organizations, other political organizations that the Prince founded. But to be sure, there were other kinds of organizations that supported Native Hawaiians. And when they say that Hawaiians did not govern ourselves, or there was a period in which there was a lack of Hawaiian governance, it's not true, because we had those royal societies that supported the Native Hawaiian people and played a governance role or self-governance role of a kind. And then we also had land hui that had formed after the Mahele had failed to distribute the lands adequately to Native Hawaiians, and Native Hawaiian families grouped together and formed a hui and pooled their resources and purchased lands together. And these land hui were still very active through the early territorial period during the lifetime of Prince Kūhiō. And of course, we also had the Ali'i trusts, who were also formed in the Ali'i era, and they were providing support to Native Hawaiian elders, as in the case of Lunalilo Home, the Kamehameha schools, educating our lahui, and the Queen Emma Foundation at the time, earlier in the early part of the century, was still supporting the Queen's Hospital, And then the Queen Lili'uokalani Children's Center was started, even the Queen's Trust was started even before she passed on. But I wanted to share, because not all of us realize that there was this controversy by Prince Kūhiō with Governor Frear. And Governor Frear was married into the Dillingham family. And he was very much aligned, therefore, with the ruling oligarchy. And this is what Prince Kūhiō had criticized him about. And I want to just read from my, my book. He was concerned that Kuhio was not upholding the land policy. So at the time of the establishment of the Organic Act, the policy for land was that the crown lands, which had been leased out to ranches and plantations under King Kalakaua, would continue to be leased to the ranches and plantations until those leases ran out. And those leases started to expire in 1918 and 19 and 20. And so Prince Kūhiō was concerned because these leases were expiring, but the lands were not being distributed to the Native Hawaiians. Actually, they started to expire in 1914 and 15 earlier. And so he was concerned that the lands were not being distributed to the general public, which was the policy, because Frear kept trying through his efforts and the efforts of the Dillingham and the lobby in DC to have those lands continue to be leased to the ranches and plantations. They did not want them to be opened up for public homesteading. So this is what Kuhio had a really big falling out with Frear, and he said in 1911, he said, "If I cannot defeat Governor Frear's reappointment in Washington, I will oppose him here when I return. I will oppose him and the party that supports him and his administration. I stand on the same platform as Link McCandless to defeat Frear's administration for another term. I will never run again if Frear is governor." And he continues, "If Frear is reappointed, I'm finished with the position I now hold. I will buck the Republican Party at the polls and attempt to put in office men of independent feeling." And so he was very critical because Frear had made promises to distribute lands for homesteading, and he never did. And I wanted to share another one of his quotes since we're featuring the prince. "I myself heard the governor in a speech at Waiohinu, that's in Ka'u, promise the people that the Kama'oa lands would be opened up to homesteaders within 3 months. And I supposed this had been done. I never knew that the lands had not been opened up until I got to Waiohinu and they told me about it. That put me in a bad position with the people there, for I, relying on the statement of the governor, had promised them that the land should be opened up. Governor Frear made me lie. The people don't like that and I don't like it. The plantations can get anything they want from Governor Frear. The people can't get anything. That's the kind of man Governor Frear is. Yes, I suppose my remarks about the governor do amount to a split within the Republican Party." And then he continued, he was preparing to disassociate himself from the Republican Party because Frear, they were supporting Frear as delegate. And he wrote, "I myself have been supported by the plantations in my candidacy for delegate in past elections, but I have also been supported of the free will by the mass of voters at large. I had hoped until recently that those in control of the industrial system of Hawaii would of their own motion and by the pressure of changed conditions conform to the due demand upon them, and that their protestations of goodwill to homesteads and a permanent home population would result in an upbuilding and success of a movement to secure such results. But successful homesteading is confessedly at a standstill in Hawaii today, and the true attitude of the local administration and the plantations today seems to be that they want homesteads to succeed if they can succeed, so as not to disturb them or their profits or their domination over affairs, which in its final phase to all practical purposes mean they do not want homesteads at all, or a population attached to the soil. So in the election of 1912, he was opposed by the Charles Rice on Kauai, and the Republican Party tried to defeat Kuhio. So this became a wide open split in the, in 1914. So in 1912, he was challenging him. He called for an investigation. Frear was investigated, but he was reappointed. And in 1914, the first year that primary elections were held after the Frear controversy, the oligarchy fielded Charles Rice against Prince Kūhiō in a campaign that pitted Hawaiian against Caucasian and was reminiscent of the 1900 battle between the Independent Home Rule Party, the Kuakoa, and the Republican Party. So as I said, Kuhio had threatened not to run again, but I guess he decided that if he didn't run in 1914, then that would play into the hands of the Republicans even more, because then who would oppose Frear and continue to try to hold them accountable, and who would continue to work for homesteading. And so he did run in 1914 again to be delegate, but the Republican Party fielded Charles Rice from Kauai, who they thought was a really strong opponent and could defeat Kuhio. And this is one of a sample of an appeal in the Kaholo Mua newspaper by Prince Kūhiō. He wrote, "I call on each and all of the islands to vote only for Hawaiians, from Hawaii to the setting of the sun at Lehua. By voting for our own race, we will be saved. The great wish of my heart is that you will do this work to keep the government of the land for the people who heretofore possessed then this work will be for true Hawaiians. By voting for others than Hawaiians, it will be like the plague on our beautiful city of Honolulu. Rise up, my people, in your own interests on the 12th of September. Whether we gain victory or not will depend upon you, Hawaiian voters." And he won an overwhelming 2-to-1 majority victory over Charles Rice, despite of the Republican Party. And then we see that in November, on November 13, 1914, he forms this ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua on Hawaii, the Hawaiian Protective Association. So he has come to the realization that Hawaiians really start to organize as Hawaiians for Hawaiians. And he founds this ʻAha Hui, and it was formed here. This is his home at Waikiki next to the Moana Hotel, and his home Pualelani. And 200 Hawaiian leaders gathered there. Puʻuhonua on Hawaii. And the president was Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole. The vice president was Mayor John Lane. The secretary was Reverend Akaiko Akana. I found out that my grandfather, Daniel Pamawaho McGregor, was the treasurer. The auditor was Reverend John Wise. There were directors, William Sheldon. I couldn't find something for S.C. Dwight. And their executive secretary, who was their paid, like an executive director, was Noah Webster Aluli, the grandfather of Noah Emmett Aluli. This was the purpose of the ʻAha Hui: reclaim and uphold the traditional principles of good and just living of the Hawaiian race, such as living as one with the land, in one spirit, one thought, one shoulder, and one in work under their leaders and chiefs. And and I just wanted to, I'm going to take a break soon, but these were some of the committees that they established to research and investigate problems. Celebration, of course, got to have ho'olaulea, to find members and help them receive training and get jobs in their fields of endeavor. An education committee, a health committee to promote good standards for healthy living, a fundraising committee, a committee to lobby at the legislature, a committee to find secure, safe, and sanitary living quarters, conduct charitable benevolent volunteer work, recruitment, and to print a newspaper. And the newspaper was called ʻHa Puʻuhonua o nā Hawaii. The Hawaiian Observer is how they translated it. And here's in the Hawaiian Gazette, they note that the small Hawaiian weekly, which has made its appearance in Honolulu, the first issue seeing the light last Friday, it is published by the Protective Publishing Company, and that was in April 14, 1916. And so it was in publication through the 20s. I found out from my aunt that my grandma and grandpa lived above, so that they lived on Kukui Street in Chinatown, and they also lived in Hauula. And the Chinatown house, their press, this Puʻuhonua press was downstairs, and they lived upstairs there at Kukui Street. And so I wanted to go next into the conditions that Kuhio and his leaders were concerned about, but I wanted to pause and see if we wanted to make any observations or kuka about what I've just shared.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know Hailama probably has some questions too, but this is fascinating. As we're trying to encourage more civic engagement around the population of Native Hawaiians today, right? From what you just shared with us, we can see that, you know, following right after that plea from Kuhio out to the people, there's an overwhelming kind of response at the ballot box for that. And I'm not too familiar with the newspapers of that time, but were there others like jumping in on that, and also at the you know, the community levels, like also like just pushing, or what kind of voting activities happened during that time to make sure that here is this you know, this plea that's going out, and okay, are you aware of any of those kinds of activities that were happening at that?
Yeah, well, so these newspapers were, what I'm quoting are from newspapers, other newspapers who were quoting him and following the election and encouraging people to come out and vote. And these are excerpts of interviews that, you know, they have published in the newspaper. So definitely a lot of activity, and on all the islands as well.
That's the benefit. And we haven't used, I mean, well, we use social media today, right? So social media has turned into like our, like the plethora of Hawaiian newspapers that were available during that time. You know, that's how we're using, you know, social media to get people civically engaged, right? But I think it's really good that you share this historical context, because I think, like how I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, there's this misguidance, misunderstanding about the engagement Native Hawaiians had at that time, right? And it's often used; those kind of things are often used against us, you know, to say that, yeah, no, you know, you guys didn't participate, or you know, wasn't very active. But this is a note for all of us here today on how we should, you know, vigorously kind of approach these tools that are put up in our society to be active and be self-determining with what is around us at that time. Yeah. Hailama, you had a question?
Well, I you know, you only keep adding to my excitement about Prince Kūhiō, and it's really important for a lot of us to just try to plant ourselves in the 19-teens around there and think about what is going on, you know, about a little over 20 years since the overthrow, and how I've always alluded to Kuhio's leadership saying, if I'm not going to be able to wear the ahu of the crown, I will still continue to take on the ahu of the people. And then he, you know, people tend to say, oh, he became an American, so we should look down that way. But it's really because he had to in that light. How can he continue to help his people? He took his responsibility as a crown prince of Hawaii so seriously that he was not going to let any barrier stop him from serving his people. And I'm looking at the, you know, the sentiment that you read about how he's saying Hawaiians need to go out there and vote for our people and put our Hawaiian in office. You know, some today, in today's perspective, they look at that and say, oh, that's very racist. And yet that was more national than anything.
Mm-hmm.
It was nationalism because he was just recently departed from his kingdom, and probably mentally and spiritually disconnected from his kingdom. He was probably still connected there. And then the final thought I'll have of that is, you think about Waterhouse statement in 1893 when it said, shouldn't we allow the Hawaiians to vote whether they want to be annexed or they want to be a part of the United States? And he said to allow the Hawaiians to vote would be like putting knives in the hands of babies. So, I mean, that sentiment was very common in that time, whom should be allowed to vote, etc. So this is a response to that, and it's a response to nationalism. Since I noticed you quote our ʻAha book that I compiled.
Oh, yes.
And thank you for that. Since then, we've actually found more information. Like I've discovered more about when Kalaniana'ole was really reorganized, and even more information on Mamakakau. Of course, going through the Hawaiian newspapers, now that we have the ability of Papakilo to go and look at these things, and reading the newspaper, Puʻuhonua and others, it's interesting because there's a few newspapers at the time that pit Kuhio and make him sound like he's a thug, a bully. And some of them talk about him going on street corners and shouting out the people are against him. And yet we are able to get a perspective that you're offering us too, of no, we have to understand the full perspective of what's going on in Prince Kūhiʻo's time and what he was for which he's advocating.
Yeah.
So thank you. I continue to get excited about the information from you.
So that's what I wanted to share, is what were those conditions, and also the strength of Native Hawaiians at the polls, which did give them a position of influence within the territory, but not as much as because the oligarchy was tied to the United States, in Congress, they had the advantage over our delegate, unfortunately. So I'm going to look at 1915 conditions. This is the population, and you can see the decline from 1900, well, 1920s when we're looking when the Hawaiian homelands gets established, but the decline of pure Hawaiians steadily declining there. And of course, at the turn of the century, you have tuberculosis being affecting Native Hawaiians. And then in this period here, you have the flu pandemic also impacting Native Hawaiians. But at the same time, there's a growth in the part Hawaiian population, which overall, gives us a total of 50,000 Hawaiians by 1930. And in this year, if you notice, for the first time, there are more part Hawaiians than pure Hawaiians. But up until 1930, there were always more pure Hawaiians than part Hawaiians. And actually, in the studies, it says that actually it was women who were out marrying more so than men, that women were more so out marrying other ethnicities. And then this shows that what was the proportion of Native Hawaiians in the total population, going from 24% down to 13% from 1900 to 1930. But this is what Kuhio and the Hui Puʻuhonua were so concerned about, was the health conditions. And look at the life expectancy. And see, it's not a Hawaii thing. It's not like people in Hawaii had a low life expectancy, because in 1910, Hawaiians' life expectancy was 30 years, but for Caucasians, it was 52, and for Chinese, it was 56. In 1920, which is the year, 1 year when there's the bill to pass to set up the Hawaiian Homes Commission is in Congress, it's being considered. These were the conditions they're looking. Hawaiians' life expectancy was only 35 compared to Caucasians 57 and Chinese 54 and Japanese 51. And in 1930, it does improve, but you have, even so, it's still much lower, 20 years lower than that for Caucasians, and 17 other for them. And you also had high infant mortality rates. I don't have earlier rates, but 1925 is a few years after the Commission Act is passed. And Hawaiians have such a high infant mortality rate, 136 per thousand. So 136 deaths per 1,000 live births in 1925, compared to 39 for Caucasians and 56 for Chinese. And this is what Prince Kūhiō Kalaniana'ole states: the Hawaiian race is passing. And if conditions today continue to exist as they do today, this splendid race of people, my people, will pass from the face of the earth. So really, Prince Kūhiō, as you can see from this quote, and the other Hawaiian leaders in the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua really believed that Native Hawaiians would become extinct if nothing very dramatic was done to rescue the Hawaiian race from continuing to decline as a people. There's a lot of competition from other ethnic groups. You know, the poi mills were all not owned by Hawaiians, but by Chinese, although some of these Chinese were married into Hawaiian families. There was competition as Japanese were moving off the plantations in this period and beginning to compete with Hawaiians in the trades, especially, and in fishing. Japanese dominated the fishing industry at this time. And we see that at the early, beginning at the 1900s, when sugar was, had a secure market now being part of the United States, the sugar growers all invested in water diversion systems, carrying water from the windward sides of the islands to the leeward sides of the island. And this is all from like 1900 to 1915, which is all occurring, these diversions, the Waiahole ditch tunnel system, bringing water from Kahana to Haiku, and then through the Waiahole tunnel, and the system, the Hamakua ditch system on Hawaii Island, the Pioneer Company ditch system, bringing water from the windward side also. And so this led to a lot of taro lands becoming marginalized, and people who could no longer farm because they no longer had the free flow of water given the diversions, moved into the cities, into Honolulu. And there was a lot of overcrowding, and they lived in tenements in Iwilei and Chinatown. And these are areas where you rent a room and you share a common bathroom and common kitchen facility. And this is the conditions which tuberculosis was rampant, as well as other flus that came through the town. And then you had a really large, like 600 people living in Kaka'ako in the squatter camps there. And these were not even in tenements. They were just living in, they described wooden boxes, old wooden crates that were made into makeshift houses and other just makeshift conditions. Although they had access to the ocean and there was one water line, they still, living under very poor conditions. And then in 1917, the US joined the World War I, and that disrupted shipping, raising the prices of poi and fish and putting a strain on the tenements and the squatter areas. So in November 1918 to 1919, we have the report. He's at the end of his period. I'm sorry, I wanted to quote here. Oops. I just wanted to quote from the report of Noah Webster Aluli. And he wrote about getting Hawaiians into Kamehameha St. Louis and Lahaina Luna, and upon graduation to law school and normal school for teaching and training. They also taught that the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua had also taught good hygiene. And he's saying, and he reported that the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua had drafted a legislative bill, which he called the Puʻuhonua Resolution, and had presented it to Senator John Wise for him to fight through the legislature beginning in January 1919. But by April 25, 1919, the House of Representatives had passed the resolution. So that's in 1919, but the year prior to that, November 1918, it must be the ʻAha Hui and Kuhio and the leaders decided that they need to further, more deeply organize into the Hawaiian community. And they decided to found the first of the many Hawaiian Civic Clubs that we have today. And they met in November of 1918 here at the Alexander Young Hotel at the corner of Bishop and 4th Street. No, Bishop and what's that? King Street. No, it was Bishop and I forget the cross street now, Bishop and Hotel, I think. And Prince Kūhiō, Rudolph Duncan, Jesse Uluuhi, J.C. Lane and Noah Aluli and 40 Hawaiians met together to establish the Hawaiian Civic Clubs. And oops, let me go forward. And the purpose of the Hawaiian Civic Clubs when they established it was to discuss and take action on matters of importance affecting the welfare of the Hawaiian people and to perpetuate the language, history, traditions, music, dances, and other cultural traditions of Hawaii. So this bill that Noah Webster Luli is referring to was a bill that would set aside the crown lands that were now expiring, the crown lands that King Kalakaua had leased out to ranches and plantations in 1885, 86, 87, and they were expiring in 1915, 16, 17, and they were supposed to now be opened for general homesteading by the public. But the bill that the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua na Hawaii put together and was backed by the civic clubs was to set aside the crown lands for homesteading exclusively by Native Hawaiians for the rehabilitation of the Native Hawaiian people. And this original bill is what eventually became the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act of 1921. So as I said, the crown lands had been leased, the crown lands were the lands that were set aside by Kamehameha III at the time of the Mahele for his personal use and to pass on to his heirs and successors. And over the course of the years, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that these crown lands did not belong to the individual king or queen. And this was first determined when Queen Emma sought to have her inheritance from the crown lands, being the heir to Kamehameha IV. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, these lands do not belong to the King Kamehameha IV as a person, but in his position as the successor to Kamehameha III as king. So these lands then passed on to Kamehameha V and to King Lunalilo, and then to King Kalakaua. But then Princess Ruth challenged whether the lands should pass from the Kamehameha dynasty into a new dynasty of Kalakaua. And the Supreme Court ruled that no, these lands are to be passed on to the next dynasty, the Kalakaua dynasty, and that the lands could not be alienated, but they could be leased out to generate revenue for the king and the queen, or the queen later. And so these leases are what supported the lifestyle of the king and queen. And they were very cheap leases. They came out to pennies on an acre when you really look at, they leased out in large tracts to the ranches and the plantations. And under the Organic Act, the lands were supposed to be homesteaded by general public, which is what I just spoke of, how Kuhio was concerned. But going into the Congress with this bill, there were two competing interests. One was the Native Hawaiians are attempting to have the crown lands reserved for Native Hawaiians to homestead. The Big Five want to have the crown lands reserved to continue to be leased to the ranches and plantations. And the general public are, of course, supporting the opening of these lands for homesteading, but by the general public, not exclusively for Native Hawaiians. And this is what Prince Kūhiō says: I introduced this bill to set aside for the Hawaiian people lands that originally belonged to the Hawaiians. We find that the people who live in the tenement houses in the city are nearly all Hawaiians. Maybe we will be able to get them to go back to the land and rehabilitate the race. These Hawaiian families living in the tenements are poor, and they do not own an inch of land in their own country. Now, as it turns out, the lands that were set aside were not just the crown lands, but a combination of government and crown lands that fell into agricultural class 3 and 4. And so what happened when the bill went to Congress is that now the oligarchy interceded through their lobbyists and their representative of business, the Hawaiian Chamber of Commerce. And what they managed to get the Congress to do was to look at the lands and classify them first, second, third, and fourth class lands, both the crown lands and the government lands that had been ceded over to the federal government by the Republic of Hawaii, and which was being held in trust for the people of Hawaii. And then they decided that they would turn over the third and fourth class agricultural lands for Native Hawaiians to lease, and continue to lease the first and second class agricultural lands to the ranches and the plantations. And the revenue from the leases to the plantations and ranches would then fund the Hawaiian Homesteading Program, opening up the third and fourth class lands to Native Hawaiians to farm. But as you can see, some of these lands, Kama'oa, less soil covering rock, same as above. This one, Pu'ukapu land, adjacent to site where it had failed. Fourth class grazing, no water, beyond reach of water. Ka'ohe Maku'u and Puna, rocky, almost fertile soil, well situated for fishing. And on Kauai, Moloa, no agricultural grazing lands. Anahola and Kamalo Malo, second class ag, require irrigation. Upper Waimea, valueless without fattening lands, rough, rocky, very dry, can produce crops of $1 million spent. Maui, Kahiki Nui, third class grazing. Most land can be grazed only a few months of the year due to frequent dry spells and steep and rocky and Kula lands. Kula and Kahiki Nui there. And then on Molokai, where the first pilot project was, the first homestead that had to succeed in order for the expansion to occur, was here at Kalamaʻula, upper half second class ag, lower same as Pala'au. And some of these lands were a steep part of mountain, worthless for ag, but Pala'au with irrigation would produce crops. And the Hawaiian homelands here shown in yellow. There's also lands here at Kalaupapa, are also Hawaiian homelands. And then on Oahu, Nana, this was a compromise then that worked out between the big five, the Native Hawaiians and the general public. The first and second class ag lands would be reserved for ranches and plantations. The third and fourth class lands would be reserved for Native Hawaiians to lease, but no lands for the general public. And funding for Hawaiian homelands would come from the ranch and plantation lease rents. Other compromise, the oligarchy was insisting that those who could qualify should be full Hawaiian. And Kuhio and the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua said, no, we did not want to set any kind of blood quantum on this, but if you want to, it should be 1/32 Hawaiian. And the compromise was reached at half Hawaiian ancestry. So the final act was, half Hawaiian or more beneficiaries who would qualify for 99-year leases at $1 a year. And there was 203,000 acres of third and fourth class ag land set aside to be funded by leases of the first and second class ag lands to ranches and plantations. And this was poor land, but an important precedent to establish a trust relationship by the US Congress with Native Hawaiians. So I wanted to start there and see what comments we want to have in discussion about that.
Oh, that was a lot. And what you just covered there has been probably the crux of the discussions around for the last, say, 30 to 40 years around the Department of Hawaiian Homelands and the intentions of the Hawaiian Homestead Act, and then the reality, right? The reality of it.
Right.
But it was so good because I think what was missing in that discussion often is the context that you provided, right? That context from the leading up to, like I didn't know it went through a local process first. I didn't know it was submitted to the local legislature first. And, it was kind of sorted out in the ʻAha Puʻuhonua first, presented here, and then eventually made its way right across the shores up to the congressional level, and then becoming a federal, a federal act. So that was, I think a lot of people out there after they watch this will at least get those real basic tenets down, right? You broke it down so that we could chew on it in smaller pieces. Yeah, so thank you for that. Hailama, do you have some questions?
Yeah, a couple of points. I mean, I'm so happy to see that you brought up the fact that the Hawaiian Civic Club was established actually in November of 1918. So we've been using the December 1918 for years because I think there was a formalized meeting, but there were a few Fridays back before that, and I do have an article found in the newspaper showing the start to be, I think, November 20th or November 26th. I'm off the top of my head, I'm kind of blank. But by December 1st, they already had 70 members in membership. I mean, it grew from that 40 to 70 within a week, I believe. And so the movement really grew. I was impressed in one of their first official actions in January was to break up an opium den. And it was actually the contribution to a clean society, that we as Hawaiians are not going to tolerate this misbehavior of others. And so they took things into their own hands. And there's just so much to the story of Kuhio and his work. And the fact that calling on the ʻAha Hui to reopen in the start of the 1900s, and then on top of that to establish ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua ona Hawaii, and then I guess it merging into the association, and I've never gotten to ask you this question. We see the ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua kind of die down when the Hawaiian Civic Club opens up. Is it because it did transform completely there, or was there a shift in let's say beliefs on what should happen? What happened to ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua? A complete shift to Hawaiian Civic Club? Is that what happened?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think because too, Prince Kūhiō passes away in 1921 or 22, right after the passage of the act. So, I think maybe the emphasis shifts over to trying to implement the Hawaiian Homelands program. I'm not really sure why it loses momentum. I needed to do more research on that. And I know Noah Webster, Lily's family, is interested in doing some research to see what happened, because he did continue to carry forward and continue to, when there was a bill for statehood, he went to testify and to say, I would support it, but only if Native Hawaiians are given the same rights as Native American Indians to organize as a nation if we were going to be incorporated, as a state. And then he also had concerns about how the Hawaiian Homelands was being administered. So we remembered active, but I'm not sure at what point the ʻAha Hui phased out and why, and maybe there are other organizations that were also forming at the same time that might have been going in different directions. Because I know there were always efforts to try to cohere a business, business cooperations and cooperatives. And so I think people were just going in other directions. Also, by the 30s, Hawaiians had pretty much been dominant in the polls and had dominated the elections. But then by 1930s, their dominance of the polls receded. And I wanted to just share that, because when we're talking about Hawaiians being active in politics, this is the number and percent of Hawaiians registered to vote from 1902 to 1930. And so you can see, out of the total number of registered voters, 8,680 were Native Hawaiians. So Hawaiians made up 68.8% of the Hawaiian voters and continued to dominate. 66.6% of 1910, 55.6% 1920, when the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was making its way through the territorial legislature and to Congress. But then by 1930, it declines to 38%. And a large part of the reason is because up until the 30s, under US law, first generation Japanese and first generation Chinese could not become US citizens, and therefore could not participate in electoral politics. And so for that reason, you don't have, even though Japanese and Chinese made up, and then later as Filipinos entered it, those Asian groups combined made up the majority of the population. They did not make up the majority of voters because they didn't have the right to vote. But then by 1930s, you see there's now a second generation, the Nisei, becoming active in politics, a second generation of Chinese, less so Filipinos, but now there's beginning a shift in the 1930s, and that will also result in a shift in politics from Republicans to Democrats and from Hawaiians to Japanese in terms of the participation in politics. Sorry, I took that in a different direction, but anyway, I wanted to share how dominant Hawaiians were and that they participated actively, up until 1930 and really through the war. And it wasn't really until 1954 when the Democrats took over that you had, a minority of Hawaiians in politics or in the legislature. Up until that time, the majority of Hawaiians were Republicans and they were voting and they were being elected at both the legislature, the statewide or the territorial-wide legislature, as well as in the counties. And Hawaiians really dominated the county boards of, they called them boards of supervisors at the time as well. And there was a lot of participation at the county level.
Your contributions to our leali'i were so valuable, and I'm so happy that I started to tell you before we began the live feed today that I was really inspired by your presentation to the Haleonali'i Hawaii Convention several years ago on Maui. And you flew up to Maui just to be with us and share. And honestly, I will plead ignorance. I knew nothing about ʻAha Hui Puʻuhonua until you brought it forward. And at that point, it kind of stirred the gears saying, my goodness, we need to tell this story more and more. So I'm glad we had this opportunity today with Leali'i to be able to bring this out, because I'm sure there's so much of our history still hidden to our people. And the best way Kamehameha II always implored wisdom, and therefore, and so did our ali'i behind him, following him. And I think we got to continue to listen to our stories as told by our people in our Hawaiian language newspapers and from our oral traditions, and learn from them and understand the context of the folks back at that time, and make our judgments with all of that full understanding. And that's why I really appreciate that you've captured that for us.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of this Leali'i program. Mahalo for including me.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, Dr. McGregor. I mean, again, this has been eye-opening for myself too, right? We've always heard that we're civically engaged, right? Early on, we always heard that we were participating, but to hear the hows and the whys and the whens is such a great thing, So again, mahalo for providing that context, to that. Yeah. Do you have any more to share, Dr. McGregor?
I had some
you
more,
can.
Oh.
Yeah. No, you can.
Well, I wanted to share because there's a lot of disappointment that the lands that we got were so poor. Share something that well, first of all, I wanted to share this something from the resolution, the Puʻuhonua resolution, about how much hope they had if Hawaiians could be returned to the land. And what strikes me is that it recalls to me that in 1845, when the King Kamehameha III and the Council of Chiefs announced that they were going to set up a system of private property, and allow foreigners to own land, that thousands of people petitioned against this, and they were saying, no, withhold the land, it's so precious, it's going to be gone, and the money will be lost, but the land will be with us forever. Hold on to the land, and they use it, to be stingy and just keep it. And so, but again, it shows such faith in the land. I wanted to read from that. So it says here, whereas the distribution of lands under the Kingdom of Hawaii, whereby the power to alienate the same has resulted in the loss to the Hawaiian people of a large part of their original birthright, so that the members of the race now constitute a large part of the floating population, crowding into the congested tenements districts of the larger towns and cities of the territory under conditions which will inevitably result in the extermination of the race. And whereas members of the Hawaiian race or blood should be encouraged to return to the status of independent and contented tillers of the soil, preserving to posterity the valuable and sturdy traits of the race, peculiarly adapted to the islands comprising the territory of Hawaii, inhabited and governed by peoples of their race and blood as their birthright for a long period of time prior to the annexation of the United States of America. And whereas there is now available or soon to become available large tracts of public lands under the control, that there should be encouragement for associations or colonies of individuals of Hawaiian blood for mutual growth and help to bring a rehabilitation of their race and to furnish an incentive for the preservation of the best characteristics of an independent citizenship of Hawaiian blood. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate of the Legislature of the Territory of Hawaii that these lands, be turned over and reserved for Native Hawaiians. So, this was the hope. And this is another statement I wanted to share that the ʻAha Hui wrote. There must be land legislation to enable the race to secure more land than it has in order to substantiate its earthly existence and to establish more than ever before a rightful claim to the land of its birth. And then it says, the soil is a redeeming factor in the life of any race, and our plan for the rehabilitation of the Hawaiians is futile unless the question of returning to Mother Earth takes precedence to all other considerations in such a plan. Therefore, the question of rehabilitation of the Hawaiian people, not only on the basis of education, but on their direct contact with Mother Earth, is paramount at this moment. And insofar as experience has proven and much science has conditions, the elimination of poverty and pauperism, the establishment of business relationship with the business world, the deepened appreciation of the soil and of the material wealth, all of these benefits not come from the fashionable life of this century, but by the intimate desire that, having these lands set aside, and not just the ag lands that they ended up with, the crown lands that were the lands of our king and queen. These are the lands of our lahui, and they should have been set aside for Native Hawaiians, not continue to be leased out to the ranches and plantations. But these were the lands, that they were seeking to have set aside. And so it was disappointing to everyone that, that the lands that ended up being set aside were these third and fourth class Hawaiian lands. And I only had this from what Prince Kūhiō, in September, he was campaigning in, I guess it was 1920, the bill was making its way. And he said, this rehabilitation bill is the first opportunity given the poor man to go on the land with funds to help him make a living. They say that the lands to be set aside under this bill are no good. If I were to attempt in Congress to take away cane lands for the Hawaiian people, there would be a terrible row. One would never hear the last about. They say the bill will kill homesteading. Nothing of the kind. The money from the first-class agricultural lands will go to supporting the Hawaiians on the other lands. This will save the Hawaiian people from being a dead race. So, he still believed in the ability of the Hawaiian people to make the lands productive. And he personally, here in Molokai, families tell the story very proudly of how the prince went personally to ask them, to apply for the homestead lands, because he knew so much was riding on the success of the Kalaniana'ole homestead. And so he personally went and asked them, people he knew were productive and could make the land productive to come and settle here on Molokai, and to give the homestead that first boost to be successful. And indeed, they were successful. And so that's why then it expanded, the next place expanded to was to Keaukaha, and then eventually to all the islands.
Mahalo nui for that. You know, the more you talk, the more I'm inspired. Just like how Hailama is, you know, about Prince Kūhiō, but just the ability to navigate such tricky currents at that time, right? We often, and I have been one of those people in my younger days, very quick to judge, you know, the past and movements and actions, you know, moving forward. I've learned over time, thank you, too much maturity, that hearing the context of the time and place, and then also the heavy lifting that you know, that awamo of that really heavy burden of the well-being, the mauliola of a whole people's, right? Not just one community, but a whole people's. And how he, as Dr. Akana said last week, you know, it's amazing how with no voting power, absolutely no voting power in the U.S. Congress, was able to get a congressional act passed, right? And due to, you know, careful negotiations, work door to door in the communities, right? Like just that kind of effort being put into a long range vision, right? Like a wanana into the future that is not just looking for a short term, like let's just get it up and go, but a real kind of visionary activity that he was doing, right? Yeah, I'm just, again, I'm not a homesteader, you know, I don't qualify for homesteading. I'm not a civic club member yet, even though Hailama tries every time we talk. But I am definitely, you know, just I honor, you know, Prince Kūhiō for those deeds. Just wondrous. I don't even know if today, you know,
Well, you know,
if our vision is so great.
Meana and Dr. McGregor, you think about the committees they set up even in Hui Puʻuhonua. So our committees in the Hawaiian Civic Club, our caucuses in CNHA, some of them mirror. I mean, look at health. Health is there. Health is there today. It was there back then. So obviously it was something really important for our people and our elite. Education was there and is still in our caucus and our committees today. And then I love the way they had ho'olaulea. The fact that you cannot give up that spirit of ho'olaulea, the spirit of le'ale'a. It is a part of who we are. And, you know, to think about all that you said, Mehana, about Kuhio, and the fact that he did all of this by the time he was 50, you know, and he passes away at age 50, I think January of 1922. So he leaves us at age 50, and yet how impactful was his work in these 50 years, and really maybe the last 20 of them, 25 of them, where he actually started fighting for the rights of his people. And we are benefiting today because of his work. So talk about critical impact, and there's a champion. And he would probably definitely say, you know, I'm just there as one of the many. And Dr. McGregor started by sharing many of those folks with that first slide of the ʻAha Puʻuhonua and the ali'i of among our maka'ainana that stood up and helped lead our people.
Yeah.
You know, such great stuff. I mean, you know, we're about at that time where we were coming to an end of our program. I just, you know, mahalo nui, aloha nui wau ia oi e kumu McGregor, for all that you have done just in your lifetime, but also for this very enlightening presentation today, right? Again, I think it'll be a hallmark for many people who are watching now and those who will watch this later on leali'i.org. You know, they will get some great insights. And I consider myself a learned person, and I'm constantly learning new things, especially with these presentations. Yeah, so thank you for that. And you're still up at the university, yeah? Are you
Yes,
still
I
teaching
am
up at the
at the
university?
Department of Ethnic
Yeah.
Studies. Yes.
God, I love all you guys. Yeah, up there.
I'm also the director for the Center for Oral History, and so
Oh, okay.
we're trying to also collect these stories and histories that will help broaden our understanding of you know the role that Hawaiians have played in politics and Hui. One of our projects is documenting the Ko'olawe Aloha Aina movement and interviewing, those who are in their 70s now and going on some 80s to, about their role in founding the Aloha Aina movement that has expanded and broadened. So this is the modern movement. But we see, and I think even when Noah Emitaluli was inspired to found the Protect Kala'awe Ohana, and he and George Helm said their goal was Aloha Aina, that he was reflecting on what his grandpa had done for establishing the Hawaiian Homelands Program, and then what his grandmother's, Noah Webster's wife's aunt, Emma Nawahi, had done with Joseph Nawahi to establish the original Aloha Aina organization and published the Ke Aloha Aina newspaper. And so that, of course, also influenced Noah Webster. Noah Webster Aluli was mentored by Joseph Nawahi as well.
Wow. So much, all the ka'inoa, all the naive, right? And ha'aheo na mamo e na kupuna. Yeah, like just bask in the light of that work that has developed right today, come, down, kind of, continuing on through the generations now. And I could see you guys, right? You guys are, even though you guys are older, you guys are still like continuing that work and passing that down to children and grandchildren on. So mahalo nui for that legacy that we all get to be, a part of there. Yeah. And, yeah, I'm going to go back and watch this again later. Yeah. But coming up, this is just one, or this is the third out of 4 presentations that we're doing in honor of Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniana'ole. Next week, coming up on his the celebration of his 150th birthday of this great man, we will be featuring discussions with young Native Hawaiian leaders who have assumed the role throughout his legacy, right? So the legacy of being with establishing the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, or through the Hawaiian Homestead Act, right? We have Deputy Tyler Gomes will be joining us. Also from the civic clubs, because Hailama is kind of, coming in schools, but he also, is always, representing so graciously the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs. But we will feature actually Dre Kalili, who's the 2nd vice president of the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs now, and talk about that legacy.
She's the first
vice president. I'm sorry. First vice president of the association. And then from his seat in Washington, D.C., as our congressman, Representative Kaiali'i Kahele will also be joining us next week. So we have a panel, rightly so, started off with the mo'oku'auhau of Kuhio, to some of his great deeds, to this very
Mihana frozen for all of us.
Oh, thought it was my.
So I mean, I'll pick up where she left off until she unfreezes. So yeah, we'll begin with the moku'ahau, and actually some of it is what you folks have set the foundation over these past weeks to establish that mo'oku'ahau, and then to carry it through with these current servants of our people and of our lahui that are either, like we said, Representative Congressman Kaili'i Kahele, who is in the seat, Prince Kūhiʻo's son, and others that mentioned Tyler as well as Davianna. And we do want to welcome all of you to join this, and reminder that you can rewatch any of these episodes on leali.org, and please, we appreciate the comments that are posted in Facebook and shared, and continue to do so. And we'll probably work on having a place where we can kind of set some of these in a library or an item. I like your oral history.
Oh, yes, yes.
So might
We
be
would love to
something
have
we
it.
could put copies there and
Yeah. We have to
share them
transcribe it.
out.
If we can transcribe it,
Yeah.
yep, that would be perfect. We would love to have it.
Well, I guess I'll be the one closing us off today. I want to thank all who made this possible. Definitely, Dr. Davianna McGregor, thank you so much for your time. I know it's so valuable that you've given it to us. To Mehana Kala, who is, I know, trying to get back online. To Kavena, who's our tech person. And also, of course, our organizations, and that is CNHA, Kamehameha Schools, the King Kamehameha Day Celebration Commission, Department of Hawaiian Homes, Land, Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, and Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And thank you all, and mahalo to all of you for joining us. Today's show will be broadcast, and you can it'll be put up later for all to watch. So mahalo again, Dr. McGregor, and aloha to cousin Emmett, and aloha all. Thank you.
Aloha, ahiho.
We hold.